Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. I am your host, Christy Haberman. I am glad you're here. Thanks for being a part of our community. A few disclaimers before we get started. I am a licensed therapist. However, this podcast is not to be considered mental health therapy or counseling. It is for entertainment purposes only and is not associated with my counseling practice, Christy Haberman Counseling Services. Thanks for showing up. Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. This is your host, Christy Haberman, and Kai the Wonder Dog. If you hear her clinking in the background, she just heard her name. Or the clicking on the floor, that's her moving around. Thank you for everyone that has been listening to my podcast. I appreciate you listening and taking the time. I would love to hear your comments. If there's anything you'd like me to talk about or anything that you would like to talk about, I am open to having guests on my podcast. In fact, I'd really like it because I tell my story, but I think it's important that everybody having the opportunity to tell their own story. And so if you are interested, please reach out to me at Grieving Insomniacs on Instagram. I have a Grieving Insomniacs on Facebook. I have a Grieving Insomniacs at Gmail email. It's probably better to message me on Instagram or on Facebook. I don't really have access to the email during the week since I do work a full-time job along with producing my podcast. So today is 9/11/22. 21 years ago today, our nation experienced the falling of the Twin Towers in New York City. It also happens to be the 21st year of me being a counselor. And that makes me really kind of sad. So 22 years ago, in August, I graduated from Chapman University in Orange, California, with a master's degree in master's degree in psychology with an emphasis in marriage and family therapy. And that September, I started my first job as an official counselor. I was working as a school counselor in Lompoc, California. And on September 11th, it was the first day of school and also our first day of training to become counselors. And I remember getting ready for work that day and watching TV and thinking I'm watching a movie because California time is 3 hours past Eastern time. And my husband was home that day. He didn't have to work. And so he watched the news over and over and over again all day. And it played over and over and over again in the news. And at the time, I remember thinking this can't be good for people because I believe it caused many people that watch that over and over again, especially ones that are more sensitive, to have PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And I also think that it changed the grief landscape of the United States. In 2001, Christopher was 15 years old. I had no idea that he'd only live 10 more years. Would it be 10 more years? Yeah, we would only live 10 more years. I thought we had a whole lifetime ahead of us. So he was starting high school, Colin was starting middle school, and I loved my life in California. I loved it. My husband was military, and we lived in new military housing. I had my dream job. I was just ecstatic. But that was also, it was a turning point, actually, in in my life, and I didn't even realize it at the time that it was happening. So I remember driving to Santa Barbara where our training was with one of my coworkers, Ricky. And I remember giving her a pink quartz. So pink quartz is a symbolism of love. And I thought at that moment in time, knowing that the Twin Towers had fallen, that the world needed more love at the time. So we drove into work. They cut our training short, and we went home. And our world as we know it changed. And so 9/11 has significant meaning for me beyond the fact that it was a day that the United States was changed permanently. And so it's so interesting as being a grieving person, grieving mother specifically, how collectively as a society, especially at first on 9/11, our society would just grieve. We would have memorials and we would have speeches talking about everyone whose lives had been lost. And really, those brave people that came forward and talked about the grief openly of losing their loved ones in 9/11 helped change society's view of grief. I 100% believe that. And it kind of moved it into the forefront of our society. But what I really find most interesting about it is that individually, we are still telling people that they shouldn't grieve, that it's time to get over it. But yet you go through Facebook today and you go through Instagram and you see all these memes and all these posts about how we'll never forget 9/11. So it's just this interesting dichotomy between, our national grieving for what happened on 9/11 and individual grievers. And it's like, okay, we're allowed to grieve as a nation, but if we grieve too long about our loved ones that died, we're told it's been too long. Get over it. And so and it's been kind of an interesting week in that respect. And I don't really understand the significance of this, but I know there is one. Only time will tell what that significance will be. So Christopher this is so interesting. So Emily, if you're listening, I really it's stirred some thought. So Christopher had really good friends in California that he hung out with that I am still somewhat in contact with. And I thought of these kids as if they're of my own. Some of them I have on my Facebook, some of them I've lost touch with. And one of the ones that I had lost touch with reached out this week. And I think it was during the conversation I was having with her that I realized I've been kind of selfish in my grief. I've only been thinking about what the loss of Christopher meant to me and how I was grieving him and how everything, I hate to say it, was all about me. I never stopped to think about the impact of his loss on someone else. And I find it very interesting, too, that his friend from high school that kind of lost touch with him when we moved to Louisiana is grieving him so much harder that I know of than the friends he had in Louisiana. I just find that really interesting. But what else I find interesting about it is, without realizing it, she has continuing bonds with Christopher. She says that he comes to help her in her dreams. He talks to her, sends her signs, and he's really shaped her career. By knowing him, it changed what she wanted to do in her life. And I thought to myself, as I'm hearing her story, wow. Just wow. Like, and why does it take death for us to realize the impact we have on other people? But as I'm listening to her, I just have this sense of pride, both towards her and towards Christopher. And so it's interesting that today is 9/11. This is the week that she reached out, and it's the anniversary date of me becoming a counselor, of actually having the official title, and started a very rewarding career, which in 2011 took an abrupt turn. So then I had this other realization too when I was driving with my husband. And it was spurred on by this conversation I had with this friend of Christopher's. And in my mind, she's still a 15-year-old girl. But I think that she is, so Christopher will be 36, 37 this year. 36 or 37, I can't remember. Anybody that knows me knows I don't do dates well, so it has no reflection on Christopher or whether or not I'm forgetting him. I just don't do dates well. It's just one of those things. I can barely remember my own age. But in my mind, she's still that young girl. So then it got me thinking about Christopher and how there's the very real possibility that I will die and he will have been dead longer than he was alive. And that made me so, so sad. I can't even imagine that. But it's already been 11 years. There's only 11 more to 13 more years before he'll have been dead longer than he was alive on Earth. And that just breaks my heart so badly. And then I was sad for a long time, a day or two. Like, really sad. So it's like, how can that be? But it's the reality. It's a sad reality. It's a sad reality. But then I also start thinking about, so after I had this conversation with one of Christopher's friends, I start thinking about my relationship with the death. So my mom died, but I really didn't have a relationship with her, and was definitely not a good relationship. And so I never really grieved her. Not really. I grieved her most of my life because I didn't have a mother. So I've always grieved this concept of having a mother, but I didn't actually grieve her. And my dad's still alive, but I don't really have that relationship with my dad where if something bad happens, that I'm going to reach out to him and he's going to comfort me. That's not going to happen either. So I don't know how hard I will grieve when my dad dies. And then I have pets. I just lost my dog, one of them. And I grieved that pretty hard. But nothing's been like Christopher. Nothing has been as bad as Christopher. And I know it's not a competition. But I just gotta wonder, why is this so hard when it's a child? And why do we get this message that we need to get over it? So my dad was over today, and we were talking about grief. And we're talking about someone we know that lost a child a couple of years ago, and my dad says, "Oh, she's not over that yet?" I just looked at him. She lost a child, Dad. And I wanted to ask, and I probably should have asked, well, do you think I'm over it? Or do I just hide it that well from him? And I think the answer is probably that I hide it that well from him. I don't talk about Christopher with my family and how much I miss him. Actually, honestly, you guys, I only talk about that with you. This podcast has been such an outlet for that. And then when I get on there and I see that people, even it's only like 20 people an episode, and I shouldn't say only, because those are valuable people, because they make me feel like I'm heard, like they can share my grief. And it's very powerful, very rewarding. So I really encourage you, if you have the urge to tell your story, contact me. I would love to have you on my podcast. What I do is we meet on Zoom and we talk, and I take that recording and I make it into a podcast. So I'd love to hear from you, because I would like to know, like, am I different than everybody else? You know, is everybody else heartbreaking because their children died? I also want to know, do other people feel as guilty as I do because their child died? I have so many questions that only can be answered by other grieving people. And I know there's grieving people out there that need answers to their questions too, and we can help each other. But back to my dad. So I was really surprised to hear my dad say that. And so my husband says, well, it's his age. It's his generation. Except for his generation went through Vietnam and World War II. So a lot of people died during Vietnam and World War II. So did they just get over it? And I don't think they did, because PTSD really came to the forefront during Vietnam. And that's when people started to realize that combat can cause some real serious trauma issues. I mean, and trauma's now become an accepted word in our society because of those initial people that were willing and brave enough to talk about what was happening to them. So I don't know, is it a generational thing? I'm not sure, but I'm pretty positive that the grief culture in our country started to change after 9/11. I can tell you that when Christopher died in 2011, there were Facebook groups, support groups, but there was not the outpouring of, at least not in the circles that I was around. There were not the people posting on Facebook like there are now. And maybe as part of, I'm in my 50s, so maybe it's because I'm in my 50s and more people have lost children that I know. It has something to do with the fact that I see this outpouring on Facebook, but when I go on Instagram, that's where I really see the changes from 11 years ago, where people are being upfront and honest about what they're feeling about grief. And I got to tell you, 11 years ago, I was scared too. I got such negative feedback, and a lot of it was from family, about what I posted on Facebook. I got unfriended. Actually, that was the other thing I noticed this week. And it was someone I met through school. I had started a master's program in 2019, and it was just an acquaintance. It was a uh, classmate, and I was scrolling through my Facebook, and I noticed that she wasn't on my Facebook list anymore. And that's not unusual. People get off for some reason. And then I saw I got unfriended. I was like, wow, I got unfriended. And I know before I got unfriended, she had lost her mother too. So I went back. And I don't post political stuff on my Facebook, not usually. So my political views are very private. I don't really share them because I feel like as a therapist, you really can't. And you never know who sees what. So, you know, our society has changed so much in the last 2 or 3 years that I've just felt like it was better to keep my political views to myself. So it wasn't political. I post a lot of recipes. I can't see how people would be offended by recipes. I post a lot of spiritual stuff though about spirituality, mediumship, paranormal stuff, because that's one of my interests. But the other thing I post a lot about is my son, him dying, and how much I miss him. I post about that a lot. So I go back through my timeline and I see that it looks like, at my best guess, that she unfriended me around May and June. So May and June is hard month for me. Really hard month for me. Christopher found out he had cancer on the 27th of May. Hodgkin's lymphoma stage 3B. He died on June 19th, 2011. Almost 3 weeks later. And that's a terrible time for me. And I post about it a lot. So she unfriended me when I was posting about my grief. And I was like, wow. So now I'm 11 years in. So some of my anger has gone away. I still get kind of irritated and mad, but some of the anger has gone away. I've done the EMDR, so some of the trauma has gone away. But I still really miss him. I still really miss him a lot. And I post about that. And so I realized that she probably unfriended me because I was posting about my grief too much. And I thought, how interesting. Because we were in a program to be in a social work program together. So, like, going, you're a social worker and you can't handle me talking about my grief? What is up with that? Like, I'm telling you, as a therapist, it's almost unavoidable. There's the saying in psychology or being a therapist, your issues will walk in the door. So whatever you are trying to avoid in life when you're a therapist, it will rock right in and sit down on your couch and force you to face it. And that's just how the world works. So I'm like, that is so interesting that she unfriended me. And my feelings were kind of hurt. And then I really have to self-talk my way through it. And for those of you that don't use self-talk as a coping mechanism, I really recommend it. So I had to self-talk my way through it, which is ask myself the question, who was she to me? I mean, seriously, she was an acquaintance. I met her in person once, and we had a couple of projects to do for class together, which is why we were Facebook friends. Like, how much meaning can you put into that? None, really. Like, we weren't going to have an undying friendship. So there was that. And then I was like, would you change it? Would you stop posting about Christopher because she didn't like it? And be like, no, because I miss my son. Like, her inability to handle my emotions isn't about me, but about her. And I am positive. It's funny. I am positive that my family they don't read my posts. They don't unfriend me, but I'll bet you they unfollow me, which is fine. You know, if they want to pretend like they care and can't be honest about it, then so be it. So it's really interesting to me on this 9/11 day how we have this almost a line between what's acceptable to grieve and what's not acceptable to grieve, and how long you can grieve this and how long you can't grieve that. So evidently, collectively in society, if society deems it okay to grieve, we can grieve forever, right? So 9/11, we can grieve forever. Been 22 years. I don't see anybody putting out posts saying, stop grieving about 9/11. But if it's been 22 years since a parent's lost a child, I'll bet you that they get messages from people saying, how come you're not over that by now? You should be over that by now. And so, how do we bring the two together? How do we say, we can grieve indefinitely for as long as we want without judgment? That's where we need to move towards. We need to move towards that. Instead of saying, okay, you've lost your child. Now be over it. And see, here's the other thing. And for those of you that, like, I don't have feelings about losing my mom, so I can't really talk about this. But I would like to know, for those of you that have lost a parent, does anybody tell you you should be over it by now? Like, do you get those messages from people that DM you or Facebook or even to your face say it's time to be over it by now? Or is it something that is exclusively only directed towards those of us that have lost children or those of us that have had miscarriages? Like, how come that message is out there towards specifically losing children? That's what I would like to know. And if you got any theories, please send them to me, because I'd like to do a deep dive into that. So if you lost your father, do people tell you to get over it? Or grandparents, do people tell you to get over it? Is it more acceptable? I personally think it is. I think in our society that it is more acceptable to mourn your parents, your children, your grandparents, I misspoke. It is more acceptable to grieve your parents and your grandparents than it is your children. And that's a really sad state to be. I did this research for the book I wrote, The Solitary Journey Through the Loss of a Child. And there was a research study in there that said therapists had to counsel people with all of these different scenarios. The hardest one, and the one that they had most agitation towards, was trying to counsel somebody that lost a child. And they didn't go any deeper into it than besides that. But it's always stuck with me how even therapists have a hard time counseling people that have lost children. And it's the saddest thing I've ever heard. So thank you for listening. I'm running out of time as I watch it count down. If you have any questions or comments, please send me messages on Instagram at Grieving Insomniacs, Facebook at Grieving Insomniacs. Thank you for being here as we change the culture of grief in America. Please like and subscribe where you hear my podcasts. And if you want to be a guest on my show, please reach out. Thanks for listening to today's episode. This is Christy Haberman, your host of Grieving Insomniacs, and Kai the Wonder Dog. Please like and subscribe on where you listen to your podcasts. I'm available on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Anchor, and Spotify. I also have a book available on Amazon called The Solitary Journey Through the Loss of a Child. I'd really appreciate it if you'd give me a review. Thank you for listening.